Welcome to the podcast on Conversations and Connections. Today we have two eminent panelists who are zooming in from India. We have Professor Virginius Kaka, who was my mentor and teacher at the Delhi School of Economics. He's a sociologist of great eminence who was taught at Delhi School of Economics, Northeastern Hill University. He was most recently the deputy director of Tata Institute of Social Sciences at Guwahati, and also a professor of eminence at Tezpur University. He's currently a visiting professor at the Institute for Human Development at New Delhi. Professor Kaka, for those who follow Indian politics and Indian policies, will remember was the author and person who was behind the Kaka Commission, which was named after him, which was set up by the government of India in 2013 to look into the condition of indigenous communities who are known as scheduled tribes in India. Welcome, Professor Kaka.
Thank you.
With me also is Professor Jagannath Ambagudia, who is a political scientist trained at Jawaharlal Nehru University, who was taught at Delhi University. Professor Ambagudia is currently the Dean of Social Sciences and Humanities at Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Guwahati. Welcome to the two of you. Welcome, Professor Ambagudia. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm conducting this interview from the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Let me take a few seconds to mention the book that will kickstart our conversation here today. The book is called The Handbook of Tribal Politics in India. It was edited by both my guests and published earlier in 2021 this year by Sage Publications. It covers a wide area of issues focusing mainly on how indigenous communities participate in political affairs in India. Welcome to the two of you once again. And let me just begin by asking you, Professor Kaka, what prompted you to put together this book?
Well, Sanjay, I have been engaged in the study of the tribes or indigenous people in India for the last 1.5 decades or so. And although we find that tribal communities throughout the colonial period, even in post-independent India, has been engaged in series of resistance against the state, and also to some extent, let's say, the outsiders who have been taking away their land. And but then their participation in the formal political system of the contemporary India was somehow not adequately addressed. And we thought that now that they have been a part of the democratic process and a part of the parliament and the state legislatures in different states, we thought that what they have been doing, they get representations in terms of the size of their population. So in the parliament it's 7.5%, and in the states, in proportion to the size of the tribal populations in the respective states. So the participations of the representatives of the tribal communities, it has not really been explored. And when I wrote a piece sometime around 201, I did mention in terms of, because we study quite a lot in terms of representations of the tribal communities in the education institutions or the state employment. But somehow something was very critical, that representation of the indigenous people in the formal political institutions. And we have never really talked about it. And I was curious in the sense what kind of participation, what kind of constraints that they have. And that really pushed me. And I've been thinking about it for quite some time, that this is an area which needs to be explored. Because what really happens, what is the problems of the tribal representatives in the formal political institutions. And it is at this point of time that Jagannath had joined Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And I think he basically is from political science, and he has been toying with this idea of trying to do something about the tribal politics. And he had a lot of discussions. We had both of us a lot of discussions with it. And I thought it is worth exploring. But I said that, it is for Jagannath to take the initiative because I was almost on the verge of leading the piece. So I would hand over this to Jagannath, in fact, to take this conversations further.
Okay, thank you, Sanjay, for this opportunity. The interest behind bringing out this volume is both individual as well as the larger issues. Individual in a sense that I must, acknowledge that I have largely been inspired by Professor Khaka's work on tribes, and I was introduced to the areas of tribal studies when I was in MPhil, and when I came across his article that was appeared in EPW, it's called Protective Discrimination, Why Scheduled Tribes Lag Behind Scheduled Castes, and that the paper subsequently reproduced in his book State, Society and Tribes, Issues in Post-Colonial Society. That was the beginning for me to study the issues of tribal society. Then for my first research degree, that is the initial degree MPhil, I worked on the issues of tribe, as well as I continued my interest on tribal issues for PhD as well. Coming to more specifically in terms of bringing out this volume, while researching in the areas of tribal studies, as Professor Khaka has already mentioned, that I also realized that this is one of the areas that has attracted very less attention to the academia. Even if you look at the curriculum of political science departments of different universities, as being a student of political science, then you do find the cursory mentions of tribal or issues of tribal politics, not as such on the larger issues of tribal politics in the way that religious minorities and politics are being explored, or gender and politics is being explored, or Dalits or scheduled caste and politics is being explored. So that was the beginning of that was the beginning of working towards a particular volume. And at the same time, as Professor Khaka mentioned, that when I joined over there at TISS Guwahati campus, then I always try to take this issue forward, probably expanding to different areas, because I worked in the areas of policy studies, that is in the areas of reservation policy, then in the areas of conflicts in tribal India or on tribal issues for PhD. Then I thought it's important to also carry forward the idea of tribal studies, or expand the issues of tribal studies to the political sphere. And probably that was the important aspect. I introduced a thematic course for the MPhil students, MPhil students at Tata Institute of Social Sciences Guwahati campus, who had registered or who have registered for MPhil degree in social sciences. While teaching this paper, then I also realized that a lot of issues have been addressed, but at the same time, the political dimension is being left untouched or touched very little. Then that prompted me to, approach Professor Khaka for, having larger discussions on the broader issues of tribal politics. And then we decided that it is a good idea to bring out a comprehensive volume, probably at the state level, because at the initial stage, probably at the state level or state-wise tribal politics, to have the larger idea about tribal politics, rather than talking about more general idea of tribal politics in India. That essentially prompted us. The scanty literature or the lack of available reading materials for students who have been working in the areas of tribal politics essentially pushed us to work towards bringing out this volume. Another reason that prompted us to bring out the volume is that now, because of affirmative action policy or reservation policy, we do find the emergence of tribal educated middle class. And this section of the society is largely interested to explore their own dimensions or explore the dimensions of their own society. Consequently, they are also more interested to know a little more about their representation or representation of tribal communities in politics, in a way that what kind of issues, what kind of aspects are being debated at the decision-making level, such as the legislative assemblies as well as parliament. So this book is not touching the tribal politics at the local level, but we have confined, considering the hues or the number of pages included in the volume, which is around 600 pages. Then we decided to confine ourselves to confine this volume to state level politics as well as politics at the parliamentary level. And all the chapters, if you look at the book which has more than 30 chapters, then all the chapters will deal with tribal politics either at the state level or at the national level, not at the grassroots level. And that was the deliberate attempt to not include the tribal politics at the grassroots level. I mean, at the Panchayat Raj institution level. This does not mean to suggest that we are ignorant about tribal politics that is taking place at the Panchayat Raj institution level. We are aware about that fact, but considering the lengthiness of the volume, we decided to confine tribal politics at this stage as well as national level.
Thank you. I think I picked up on two very important things that both of you said right now, and I hope we can expand on them in the course of our conversation. Professor Khaka mentioned that indigenous communities in India had begun to resist far earlier than other communities in India when it came to resisting colonization, European colonization. And I think a little bit of subaltern studies also picked up on this, but never really put it as boldly as you're saying now, that it was the indigenous people in the turn of the 20th century who first took up arms and resisted British colonialism, while I think so-called mainstream India was debating other kinds of participatory ways of ruling ourselves. So maybe we'll come back to that a little later in the conversation. That's something I picked up in this conversation. And as Jagannath was mentioning, part of our the way in which we came to this was also the fact that tribal studies or indigenous studies doesn't really occupy the same. When you talk of social sciences in India, it's really caste, it's almost as if there's an erasure and forgetting of indigenous communities. So thank you both. I hope we can talk about this later on with more questions. Sure. But yeah. But I also wanted to ask, specifically on the book, can you reflect a little bit on the state of political representation of and for tribals in India today, in different parts of India today? Professor Khaka?
You see, if you start a little bit thinking about it, we don't have actually hardcore empirical materials. But in terms of just trying to reflect, on the participations of the elected representatives, either at the level of the parliament or the state institutions, I've tried to thought about it and try to say that, do they really participate? And if they have been representing, let's say, the indigenous people in the parliament, there are so many laws and the policies that were enacted from the 1950s onward to almost, even today. And you find that there has been no voices against this when there is a debate in the parliament or a state legislature. And this has always intrigued me. And many of these policies and legislations were very adversely impacting the indigenous communities. And therefore, why is it that the representatives are just not really in a way thinking about it, or not even asserting it, or not even making interventions on all that? And that is the reason we find that the land and the forest, which initially tribal communities has been occupying and for generations, as to how this has really passed, not only from the tribal communities to the state, the post-independent India, but also from the tribal communities to non-tribal communities who have been increasingly moving into the tribal areas in search of land and other support systems. So that was one. And also in case of the forest, unlike in the Northeast, you find that much of the forest on which they were so strongly dependent on the livelihood, had been appropriated by the colonial state to begin with, in terms of, let's say, Indian Forest Act, various forest policies, and what is called extension of roads and railways and other kinds of communications, etc. So that was there. But in the post-independent India, you find it was even the worse. So for if you look at the forest policy of 1952, the Wildlife Sanctuary Act, or you like the Forest Conservation Act, these were all very adversely has impacted tribal communities. And if the vulnerability that we find in tribal communities is largely because of the law that was extended to tribal areas. So Northeast, because of the historical reasons, because during the colonial period also you find the land and forest, particularly in the hills, not in the plains, but plains, as far as the plains of North is concerned, is almost the situation is the same as the tribals in the peninsular India. But I think in the hills, I think the land and forest continued to remain with the clan, or what we call kinship, or with the village community, or with the chiefs, whosoever really held. And that really continues even today. And therefore you find that large chunk of the forest in the north is still in the hand of the communities. And the size of the, the reserved forest and all, very small. But if you go to peninsular India and even plains India, Assam, then you find that the large size of the forest is actually under the state in terms of reserved forest, protected forest, and so on and so forth. So I think, so that was the reason. And therefore, I think despite this, somehow you find that the voices of the indigenous people in the parliament as well as state legislature has been very, very dormant. And I have always been very intrigued as to why no voices being raised about it when it goes against the very community you have been representing. But then in the course of conversations, we realized that, when they go more as a representative of the political party than of the people. And they represent their political party. So if the policy of the political party or the manifesto of the political party is this, then I think they don't even say about it. And also, I think there is also certain kinds of inhibitions among the tribal communities in the parliamentary system. I think there is a poor understanding of the situations, or rather, even if they understand the situation, there is a little bit inadequacy in articulations, and I think a fear to talk in the larger platform where you find the language can also be a problem, because many of the tribal communities, although they speak, but then I think they don't have that kind of depth in talking about, in understanding the overall larger situations. They may be very familiar with the local situation, but when you talk it at the level of the region of the country, I think there are so many issues, and I think that is where inadequately equipped, and maybe that may be one of the reasons. So there are a number of reasons as to why I find that the voices of the representatives has been very inadequately addressed. And I think also you find that even if they had addressed, I always felt that even if they had addressed all the indigenous communities would have come together, supposing that 44 representatives in the parliament, I think today it's 46. Even if they all ganged up, even then they won't be able to make any difference, being the size in the house of 542 or 46. I don't exactly know. What does this 44 or 46 people really matter? When you find that you have one man, one vote, and every decisions are to be made by the majority. And therefore, when you take your majority, then naturally, even if as in they come together, which doesn't really happen, they won't have really made a big difference. So this is the kind of reflections I have on the representative politics of the indigenous people in the larger political institutions.
Jagannath, would you?
If I say something about the current state of tribal politics in India. Then before I do that, very brief about the book is that we divided the book into three parts. First one is genealogy of tribal politics in India, then tribal politics at the state level, as well as the third part deals with tribal politics at the state level. And that usually take care of the case studies of each tribal, tribal politics in each state. While communicating to the author, we developed a common theme so that the entire book will be, bound together. In a sense that as Professor Khaka had already pointed out, that some of the critical areas that while writing the chapters, they need to revolve their discussions around those critical issues. And also, we have talked about the contemporary developments in tribal politics, at least in the introduction sections, as well as the other important contribution of the book is that the changing contours of tribal politics in India, more specifically in terms of tribal support base to different political parties. For instance, if we look at the national level, then the earlier the tribal support base was essentially being grasped by Congress party, but that is gradually losing the social base of tribal communities in the contemporary period. And this is moving towards the Bharatiya Janata Party at the moment. And we have explored in different chapters why such kind of changes have taken place, over the period. In continuation with what Professor Khaka was pointing out about the state of tribal politics in India, then the book usually engages with the discussion on why there is perceived relatively low participation of tribal representatives in the decision-making bodies such as assembly as well as parliament. Though we have not specifically focused on the reasons of that one, but Professor Khaka had already pointed out some of the reasons, and some of the chapters have explored why such kind of state of affairs have been happening with tribal politics. Going a little further with that one, that some of my observation at personal level, as I have been exploring the relationship between tribal MPs as well as their participation in public policies in one of my projects, what has been observed now is that these are some of the reasons that Professor Khaka had already pointed out that. And in addition to that, the parliamentary structure itself is also responsible for their low participation in the debates and discussions in the representative institutions. For instance, when a particular issue is being scheduled for discussion in the parliament, then it is the business advisory committee which will decide the time, how much time should be devoted to discuss on a particular issue, whether it is related to tribal issues or the national importance or international importance. So the parliamentary democracy is functioning in such a way where the tribal representatives are getting very little opportunity to participate in the parliamentary deliberations as well as debates. And why I'm making this kind of statement is that if we go and talk to the representatives outside parliament, they are more articulative, they are more assertive in terms of protecting the rights of the tribal communities. And why that is not happening inside the parliament, then parliament can be considered as a stage or platform where people need the opportunity to perform. And this opportunity is not being extended with sensitivity as well as commitment to the tribal communities. And once the issue is being decided to be debated in the parliament, it is the party whips of different political parties, they are going to decide who is going to speak on the issues. Because in parliamentary democracy, time is not being allocated to individual MPs. Rather, time for discussion in the parliament is being allocated on the basis of political parties. For instance, if 25 MPs are there from Congress party, and if the issue is being scheduled for 2 hours, then they will divide this 2 hours or 120 minutes among all these representative MPs and decide how much time which political party should take. And on that basis, when it comes to the participation of tribal representatives in debates and discussions of the parliament, it is always it appears to suggest, at least from the readings of the parliamentary debates, it appears to suggest that it is always the non-tribal MPs. They are getting priority to speak in the parliament than the tribal MPs. And this does not mean to suggest that political parties do not give time to the tribal MPs to speak on. They do give, but when the quantum of time comes to the tribal MPs, then that becomes very little or very small. In that way, they may not necessarily be able to express or articulate the way this should have been or they wish to be. So in that way, if we really look at the contemporary dimensions of tribal politics, then there is a need to talk about wider political reforms, the way parliamentary democracy is functioning. Instead of allocating time on the basis of the political party having the total number of MPs, then we can talk about some other alternative model of allocating time, maybe on the basis of the total number of MPs from a particular community. I'm not sure to what extent that will work, but we can always explore such kind of alternatives, considering the nature and dynamics of tribal political representatives performing in the representative institutions of decision making at the highest level.
Well, fascinating. Thank you so much. I mean, this hadn't really occurred to me, but now that you've put it so succinctly, since this is about demographics, what happens when a percentage of tribals, let's say, as is happening in Assam, there are 6 communities who are demanding that they should be considered to be scheduled tribes, indigenous. So what happens if they become indigenous and the whole political, let's say, demographics in Assam changes? What happens then? Can you reflect a little bit on that, please?
Before I take that up, Sanjay, let me just add one more dimensions into this handbook. And the dimension was that we tried to consciously try to give a space to indigenous scholars. At least in the Northeast, you find that there is a sizable number of scholars really emerging who have been writing, reflecting, in their own community or in their own society. But that's not necessarily been the case in the peninsular India. So we were really trying to find it out that let's try to push people who are from the community and who have been at least associated either with the institutes or the universities, however inadequate it may be. But we tried our best to fill in this whole, what is called tribal politics, through the writing of the indigenous scholars. And where we could not get it, then we really have tried to identify. So I thought that since there's a middle class, but also you find that now the indigenous intellectual scholars have also been emerging, and we thought that we must give them an advantage, a safe opportunity to do that. And therefore, the book may not be great, but I think they have addressed the problems which actually being experienced in the different states. So this is I just wanted to add, because I think this is something of value as far as the handbook of tribal politics is concerned. Now, coming to your questions on this particular, this is a context of Assam, and everywhere we find that there's increasing demand for scheduled tribe status. And we find it's not only in the Northeast among the Koch or Adivasis or Ahoms or Morans and all that. But then you find that it is something one has to reiterate, that this demand for scheduled tribe status is also outside. For example, in Rajasthan, this group, I'm not able to recollect, they have been demanding, not Minas. Minas are already a scheduled tribe. The other one, I'm just forgetting they have been articulating for demand for scheduled tribe status. In fact, even in the Darjeeling Gorkha Hills Council, which is basically a non-tribal, but then they have been demanding for, there is when Gurung was the chairman, he says that we must start worshipping the trees, the stones, so to become scheduled tribes, and so that we get autonomous council. Now, this whole notion has got into it that if you become a scheduled tribe, the chances of getting an autonomous district council or the state is very, it's possible. I think maybe this stigma although there is scheduled tribes, just because the idea of being a tribe, we are thought of as uncivilized or savage or primitive. But nevertheless, that kind of stigma which is associated with the scheduled caste, untouchability and all that, probably is not there in case of the scheduled tribes. And maybe that is one of the reasons as to why one would say that, we'd like to have scheduled tribe status rather than the scheduled caste status. After all, if you want the representations either in the job or in the state legislature, both things, if whether you are a caste or a tribe, both has a provision. But the demand for scheduled tribe is something intriguing. And I think as to why this has really been happening, that is, this is what I said, maybe speculation that autonomous councils or a state and all that, it may be a kind of conjecture that I have. Now, coming to Assam is a very interesting in the sense that I'm not very sure that even if all these 5 or 6 communities, they get a scheduled tribe status, is it really going to be a scheduled tribe status? Scheduled tribe state in the sense. And I think there will be a lot of problems because yes, there are communities. Even today, you find that if scheduled tribes, it is around 12.5%, around 13% of the scheduled tribe population. If the Adivasis who are around 16%, they'll make it around 29%. Then you have Ahoms and the others. So even then, I don't know whether they will really be able to make up a size of the 50% or above. I don't know the demography of other communities, but I'm a little doubtful about it. So that is there, and therefore, although demand is there, I'm not very sure whether it is really going to happen. That is also because there is also a lot of resistance by those who are already scheduled tribes. Probably if this was happened in the 50s, this problem should not have come. But today, you find that those who are demanding scheduled tribes, state may be interested to give them the status, but there's equally very strong resistance to that kind of status. So that I think is a problem. And maybe even if you enhance the cake of 12% to even 30% or 40%, problems will remain, particularly in political representation that you're talking about. Because if you really have, because there will be some small tribal communities who may get just, let's say, representations, and because of the demography, they will not be able to represent them because the other dominant community may be representing. So, that way you find that, for example, if the Adivasis around make 17%, probably you'll find in terms of politics, they will take much larger share of the representation in the state institutions. And maybe Morans and others, you will find that probably their presence will almost, let's say, conspicuously felt absent. So these are problems that are really going to come up. And therefore, I don't really know as to how these things will come. But these are issues which people have been raising, and they've been raising it. But also I feel that this whole scheduled tribe status, it gives a legal status. They accept that. Legal standing that you are scheduled tribe and therefore constitutional legal category. But when you find that after 91, there is a lots of liberalizations and globalizations and state employment is shrinking, how much representations in terms of employment and education institutions is going to make, I'm not very sure about it. Because the size of the cake is dwindling, is becoming very small. You take the hill states and even educated people now in the 80s and 90s, they were all returning to Northeast for employment because the state was expanding. Our hill states were coming up, and therefore they need people, bureaucracy to man them. But today, there is no job even in the state employment. So, educated people now are constrained to move out. And that's why you find that after the 90s, but not 90, but 96, almost 2000 onwards, people large chunk of educated indigenous scholars or even people who have educated, they're moving out in search of employment elsewhere. So these are issues which are there. So I don't know whether if scheduled tribe status is given to people who are making a demand, is really going to work. And they are all, again, economically and politically, they are not very important. In the sense, it will be the non-tribals, even when they get a scheduled tribe status, excepting maybe some small segment. They will be dominant. The Marwadis and the others, economically and politically, are very, very dominant. In that kind of situations, even if there is a scheduled tribe status, you find that probably the economic and political will remain very strongly in favor of the non-indigenous rather than the indigenous. This is just a sort of reflections I have on Assam. I'm not very sure if this is really going to happen, but this is
okay. I think before addressing this question, I think we also need to understand that why such kind of demands are putting forward. And this is not only happening with the case of Assam or in the context of Assam only. And we can see similar kind of demands were emerging in the context of Gujarat, of Rajasthan, though the state government declined to grant ST status. Then probably the Pan community of Odisha also started demanding tribal status and so on and so forth. I think one of the important reasons to understand why such kind of demand is going on is because of the scarce resources at different levels, whether it is in political spheres, social spheres, economic spheres, as well as cultural sphere. And I'm sure that those who are demanding ST status, then they do not want to have the kind of experiences that the tribal communities or who have been listed in the scheduled list have already gone through. That is the experiences of discrimination, marginalization, and so on and so forth. And I think the demands are coming up in order to have some share in the entitlement at the backdrop of the scarcity of resources. And coming back more specifically to the political dimension of your question, that whether that will make any kind of difference in terms of politics or political representation and so on and so forth. That's the reason we decided to include one of the reprinted chapters that I published in Journal of Social Inclusion Studies, where I have talked about the methodologies to determine the reserve constituencies, both at the state level as well as at the national level. And for the benefit of the reader, we have reprinted that chapter so that they can have the factors that lead to the determination of a particular constituency as reserve constituency. What I'm pointing out here is that even if the 6 ethnic communities or so are being granted ST status, I'm not sure to what extent that will benefit the perceived newly inserted or included ST category. Because if you look at the methodology that is being utilized for determination of or determining the reserve constituency, ST constituency, then it is not on the basis of how much percentage of tribal population are there at the state level. At the state assembly level, that can be, but when we turn towards the national level, it is not on the basis of the proportion of tribal population to the total state population, rather how much percentage of tribal population are existed in a particular state to the total tribal population of the country. So if we go by that kind of methodology, then even if these communities are recognized as ST, then the number of STs in India may increase and may add some additional seats in the parliament. But at the same time, I'm not sure, because the delimitation of constituencies has been frozen from 1970s. And it has been frozen till 2026. That means unless we have 2031 population census, then we are not going to revisit the demarcation of the parliamentary as well as assembly constituencies. No doubt we had the recent parliamentary and assembly delimitation constituencies order 2008, which has increased the total parliamentary seat from 41 to 47. And if you look at the state level, I think we have not, if I'm not mistaken, from 532 to 554 or so, as far as ST assembly seats are concerned. But what is more problematic for me over here is that the parliament may not move, or state may not move to reconsider, even at the backdrop of increasing rate of tribal population. It may not increase the number of seats for the tribal communities, because we just had one delimitation order in 2008, and the previous one is, if I'm not mistaken, then it was in 1970s. I don't think the state or the government will take some speedy decision, even these communities are recognized. Another problematic area over here is, that even if, hypothetically, if we consider that they are going to get the ST status, but at the same time, there are, if you look at the state level, different kind of formulas are working at the state level. For instance, in Sikkim, the Limbu and Tamang community, they were recognized, they were included in the scheduled list in 2003, but they do not have reservation in politics at the assembly level. So I don't know, even if these communities are recognized as STs, that whether that will make any impact in politics. First, whether the similar kind of status will be extended to politics or not, and at the same time, even if it is, even if they are recognized, then they may not necessarily be getting the benefit of being recognized as STs at the state level. And at the same time, as Professor Khaka rightly pointed out, that there is also politics going on at the level of ticket nomination or ticket distribution. And political parties do take the politics of number very seriously. And in that context, as Professor Khaka pointed out, that unless they are forming the substantial part of a particular, ethnic community, even within a tribal community or tribal communities, I don't think that the political parties will be interested to give them ticket. And at the same time, if you look at the contemporary, Indian politics, then day by day it is becoming very difficult for the independent candidates to win the election, even if some of them want to contest the election as independent candidates. So the issue is that at the moment we have 2 ST parliamentary constituencies in the context of Assam. Even if these communities are hypothetically recognized, I don't know to what extent that will change the number of the total seats reserved for the STs in the context of Assam, to be very specific in the context of Assam.
I mean, on this issue, I would like to bring this to a close, but is there a possibility then of some kind of, it looks difficult from all that you're saying, but is there a possibility of a pan-tribal solidarity emerging in India or in South Asia, of the kind that Ram Dayal Munda or the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact are looking for? What do you think? Do you think it's possible, Professor Khaka?
Well, this is a term which has been quite frequently being used by the academicians, let's say, even as early as probably 1980s, 70s, about the pan-tribal identity and all that. I'm not very sure, Sanjay, on these issues, because I find that there are so many layers which are external as well as internal within the so-called tribal categories, which makes it extremely problematic to come together. Now, there could be a pan-Indian identity or pan-tribal identity, let's say of the NGOs really coming together. So that kind of maybe the student unions, they can really come together. So like even in Northeast, you have NESO Northeast Students Association, which basically trying to talk of the region as a whole. So, the possibility of pan-tribal identity I see is in the context of certain social categories, maybe NGOs, human rights activists. I can see in terms of students, maybe even the politicians, who are there, probably they can really come together. So that is possible, but I'm not very sure as a people, as a people, that in the sense that irrespective of whether they are in South India or whether in the Northeast India or Central India or Northern India or Western India, whether there is a possibility of thinking about as a pan-tribal identity, I am not very sure about it, because there are so many layers of friction within the tribal community. Language is one, region is one. So, for example, I always talk about it. For example, even in JNU, when you have tribals from the Northeast and tribals from the peninsular India, they don't talk to each other. So, unless there is some issues there. So, what do you find that if Northeasterners are organizing a seminar, they will not invite the peninsular. Peninsulars, if they do it, they will not invite. So there is some degree of the problem, regional, which may be linguistics. So, as a people, even sometimes as a category, it becomes a little problematic. But I think on terms of activists, human rights activists, NGOs, politicians, students, there's a possibility.
I'm also not sure whether that will be possible because considering the internal differentiation among the tribal communities. But there is also a possibility, or there are some indications also where we can talk about the similar kind of issues. For instance, if we look at the in academic sphere, then if I'm not mistaken, there is an organization called TC, Tribal Intellectual Collective India, and such kind of organization can take off the larger issues of tribal concerns. But to what extent that will help the tribal communities to develop pan-Indian tribal identity, I'm sure. Sectarian organizations are going on, are formed on issue-based. Unless there is or there are some common issues, then it also becomes very difficult to mobilize the entire tribal support for a particular issue. So, for instance, when this Black Lives Matter issue raised up or emerged, then people started talking about tribal lives matter. So there are certain common issues which could probably give the indication that there is a possibility, but how to translate that into developing pan-tribal identity, I'm not sure.
I would, well, in that, this is a great way to kind of close this conversation close it in the sense because we're running out of time, not for any other reason. Is there a kind of, are there conversations that Indigenous rights researchers and advocacy groups in Australia, for instance, can have with their counterparts in India? What do you think? I mean, of course, slightly different situations, but what do you think?
Well, I think it has a great potential for both the Indian indigenous scholars, students, and from Australia, people who have been writing and interested in the issues of indigenous. I think it will be a very, very fascinating area, in fact, to work on, because there might be some commonalities, but there may also be great differences. And when you are looking at it, probably we have to really go back also the history and see as to how Australia worked in the two different kind of contexts. And I think I find that this indigenous people study is emerging, and I think it is high time that it is really studied across culture, across continent, and so on and so forth. And there are so many issues which are there which really make it relevant. The same sustainability of livelihood, sustainable agriculture, biodiversity, from which a lot being talked about, and from which one says that one can learn a great deal from, let's say, indigenous people. So if you really look at that, and I think how, let's say, indigenous people in Australia, or how indigenous people, let's say, New Zealand or in India, how they are really addressing this kind of issues. What is the kind of a movement? What is the kind of resistance that in India you find? What is the kind of resistance that you find? What is the kind of support from non-civil society you get, let's say, when you are taking up certain kinds of issues in India, and similarly in case of Australia. So these are, to my mind, what is called unexplored areas. And to my mind, it is a great potential. And I think, you're all there. You should really explore and take this up for further studies. I think I will really wish to see this kind of studies really coming out from the young scholars and future scholars. Really, that's fascinating.
If we look at some of the position of international organizations on indigenous population, for instance, United Nations, then they do take into account the larger common, loosely common experiences of indigenous population across the globe. And when they are, for instance, the United Nations Declarations on the Indigenous Population, rights of the, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Population. If we look at the provisions or similar kind of principles, guidelines, then those guidelines are largely being drawn or driven by the experiences of indigenous population across the globe. So that is the reason they also keep a lot of scope for the regional perspective to emerge. So the point that I'm making here is that if we really look at the potentiality of India as well as Australia in terms of exploring the areas in the areas of indigenous population or indigenous research and so on and so forth, there is a larger scope for that one, and probably Australia-India Institute can also take up some kind of initiative. Unfortunately, the International Collaboration Project, Department of Indian Council of Social Science Research, if I'm not mistaken, has left out or has not included Australia as a part of its international collaboration. Since the indigenous population in India as well as Australia, they are lagging behind in social economic indicators than non-indigenous or non-tribal population, then there is a larger scope. For instance, I was just having a look at before this, before we started this session, then the indigenous population or Aboriginals of Australia, they are lagging in terms of literacy rate. Their life expectancy rate is I think, if I'm not mistaken, then 10 years less than non-Aboriginal or non-Indigenous population, and so on and so forth. And the same is the case with the Indian counterpart, whether it is health infrastructure, educational facilities, and so on and so forth. They do have the incompatible experiences, both in the context of Australia as well as India. So there is a greater potentiality to collaborate, or they can jointly work towards addressing the issues of indigenous population or people in India as well as Australia. And at the moment, what I feel is that considering the financial constraint to take up at the individual level to establish collaboration or to collaborate with either of the counterparts, it is very difficult considering the financial constraints. But if that kind of initiatives are being taken at the research institute, for instance, Australia-India Institute, or Indian Council of Social Science Research, or if possible UGC can pitch in, then there is a larger scope to explore the similarities as well as differences that both the indigenous population of India as well as Australia are concerned.
Thank you both very much. On that hopeful note, I think it was a very, very useful conversation. All the best for the book. I hope it's doing very well. I hope it's going to places where people are able, where the policymakers are reading the book. And I hope also that you'll make sure that it comes to Australia, that people get to read what's happening to indigenous communities in India. Thank you very much. And I hope to talk to you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.